Welcome back, everyone, to Torah Today Ministries and our continued series of Psalm studies called Tehillim Talks. And this episode, we find ourselves in Psalm number 14. Now, there are two Psalms in the book of Psalms that are almost word for word identical. And those two are Psalm 14 and Psalm 53. Again, almost identical except for one verse. I'll let you figure out which that verse is. But we'll talk about that more when we finally get to Psalm 53 in the future. So just keep that in mind, and we'll revisit this at the end of the teaching about why there are two Psalms that are so very similar. So Psalm 14 begins with a very standard approbation to the choir master, Lamnatzeach, a Psalm of David. And verse 1 is very, very familiar to all of us, I'm sure. The fool has said in his heart, or the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. Now, I'm going to tell you right up front, we're going to spend most of our time in this teaching just on this first verse. Once we get done with this first verse, the rest of the psalm will go pretty quickly. But this first verse has a lot of information in it. And its familiarity to us can mask much of the depth that is found here. So let's peel back some of the translation and bring out some of the insights that this verse holds for us. First of all, the word for fool there, some translations do not translate this word naval as fool. I have no problem with it, but we have to understand that there are two primary words in Hebrew that can be translated fool. The most common one is the word kasil. You find this many times in Proverbs, and it truly means a fool, and just how hopeless the case of a fool truly is. But this word naval is just a little bit different. It has a shade of meaning to it. It can mean the degraded man, the withered man, the man who's kind of rotted away, his soul has rotted. It's referring to someone who at one time, maybe as a child, had a whole heart, but over time this heart has truly been diminished through his own bad choices and just his own corrupt thinking and ways. The word actually and its root means to wither, like a leaf that's dried up and has no life left in it. And you find it used over in Exodus 18:18. And it's where it's Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, giving some advice to Moses. And it says, you and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, naval. You're going to wither. You're going to dry up. For the thing is too heavy for you. You're not able to do it alone. So he's counseling Moses to recruit some leaders who will help him carry the burden of judging the people of Israel and counseling them. And also, you may recognize that Nabal or Nabal is also the name of a person we find in the Bible. It was Abigail's first husband. She later became David's wife. But when David first met Abigail and met her husband Nabal really acted like a fool. And so when he speaks with Abigail later, this is what she says. She says, please do not let my Lord pay attention to this worthless man Nabal. Now, that's not a very good way for a wife to talk about her husband, but in this case it was the truth. About this worthless man Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Naval is his name, and Navala, foolishness, folly, is with him. So there's a bit of a play on words there. Now it says that the fool says in his heart. Now it's interesting, the rabbis bring this out, that this phrase in his heart is ba-libo. The word for heart is the word lev, and ba-libo means in, leb, and the o means his, in his heart, be-libo. And when we find this phrase with someone speaking, it generally is a wicked person. In fact, in all the cases where this term is used of someone speaking in his heart, it's someone who's wicked. We find it first with Esau, when he's plotting to kill his brother. We find it with the wicked king Jeroboam, and we find it with the wicked Haman. They each spoke in their hearts. Now, there's one exception to this, and that's the very first time this word bet libo is found, which is in Genesis, and it's chapter 17, verse 17, I believe. And it's Abraham. But it's quite different. The context is quite different. There, Abraham is not plotting evil like Esau, Jeroboam, and Haman were. It's when God tells him that he's going to have a son. And just a year away, he's going to have a son. And Abraham just fell down laughing out loud. And he said in his heart, he's just speaking out of pure joy. And that is okay, because we all speak in our hearts, but we need to be very careful that we don't plot in our hearts. What we should be doing is speaking to our hearts, which is el libo, to his heart. And we find this phrase with righteous men. We find it with David, because it says in 1 Samuel 27:1, then David said, el libo, to his heart. There's a very profound lesson here. And the old commentary called the Midrash Shacher Tov puts it this way. The wicked are controlled by their hearts, whereas the righteous control their hearts. We need to have our minds rule our hearts. And one of the lies the enemy promotes today is follow your heart. That is exactly opposite the counsel of the Bible. We should not follow our hearts. Now, a few people who have walked with God for decades and are truly mature, and their hearts have become so united, aligned with God's, okay, maybe they can trust their hearts. But for the rest of us, we dare not follow our hearts and trust them, because our hearts are sick and weak. Until they're completely healed and whole and strong and we have new hearts, we dare not trust them. So we need to speak to our hearts, and we need to always reason with God. Now, we trust him. We have to have faith. But we always find God appealing to our reason. Come, let us reason together. And real faith is a product of coming to reason with God, to acknowledge him, to speak with him, to hear from him, and begin to walk with him. No, there's a principle, I forget where I first heard this, but you know how oftentimes negative thoughts come to you at night when you're lying down in bed? And one rabbi, I wish I could remember his name, he says the way you fix that is to go vertical. Because when you're in bed, your head and your heart are on the same level. But if you want to rule your heart and conquer these dark thoughts, get up. Get up and walk around so your head is above your heart the way it's supposed to be. And when your head rules your heart, just physically getting up can help you do this. Then you can begin to speak sense to your heart. You can begin to give the lie to these lying thoughts and expose them by bringing truth to bear upon them. So, the fool speaks be-libo, in his heart. And what does he say? He says, Ein Elohim. That's how we translate there is no God. It simply means Ein, no. Elohim, God, no God. There's no God. And when I translate this, and some translations do this way, most don't, but most translations have just this part in quotes. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God, unquote. And then as if God is speaking or David is speaking, they are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none. There's Ain, there's that word Ain again, who does good. But we can also translate it this way. We can put the whole verse after the word heart in quotes. So this is what the fool says in his heart. He says, there is no God. They are all corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. And I think this makes a lot more sense. Because one of the ways people excuse their own wickedness is by saying, well, everybody's wicked. Everybody does it. Nobody's righteous. Righteousness doesn't exist. Everybody's out for himself. And so they justify their own wickedness this way. This to me makes a lot more sense. I think this might be how David intended it to be understood. So before we go on to verse 2, I just want to share my own personal insights about atheists. And you can take this or leave it. This is not really Bible commentary right here. This is a little parentheses, or I'm just going to share some insights and opinions I have. In my life, I've observed there are three kinds of people who call themselves atheists. The first kind is the one who doesn't necessarily not believe in God. He's just angry at God. Maybe this person has been hurt by someone who calls themselves a believer. And they've been deeply wounded by such a person. And they just decide, well, that's how godly people are. People follow God. I'm not going to believe in you. Or maybe they've been wounded by some tragic event in their lives. Maybe they were abused as a child, or they lost their family in some tragic accident, and they're just angry at God. So they want to punish God by saying, I'm not going to believe in you anymore. I find this to be a very common type of atheist. They call themselves atheists not out of conviction, but out of anger and disappointment and deep wounding. But then there's another kind who calls himself an atheist. And again, they don't necessarily not believe in God. They're just hoping God doesn't exist. Because if God doesn't exist, there's no rhyme or reason to the universe. Therefore, there's no standard of righteousness. No one can say something is right or something is wrong. And so however I live my life, it's up to me. I can do what I want. But if there is a God, all of that changes. If there's a God, then I'm accountable to him for how I live this life that he's given, for how I use this body that he's created. So the existence of God is very inconvenient for someone who's invested in their own fleshly desires and their own wickedness. So again, they don't necessarily not believe in God. They're just really hoping he doesn't exist. Up until they really need him, and then they cry out. But then there's a third kind of atheist. And this is actually what I might call the spiritually healthy atheist. This is the one who doesn't believe in the God that they have been taught about. And maybe they've been so mistaught about God, and God has been so misrepresented to them, that in their hearts they know, well, that can't be the way God is. God must not exist, because I just reject that teaching. So this person is actually moving into a more healthy position. It reminds me of the story of the rabbi on the airplane, and next to him is sitting a young man who's an atheist, and they get into conversation. And as they begin to talk about spiritual things, the young man looks at the rabbi and says, Rabbi, you have to understand, I don't believe in God. And the rabbi smiles, looks at him and says, well, the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. So some people, by becoming atheists, are actually stepping away from a false God that they have been taught, maybe in a cult or a very unhealthy faith community. And they're stepping out of that and thinking, well, I just don't believe in God because I can't believe this nonsense I'm being taught. So they're actually stepping in the right direction. They're stepping closer to truth by stepping away from something they know to be false. So these are, in my observation, the three kinds of so-called atheists that I've encountered. But to tell you the truth, and you may strongly disagree, I don't believe anybody in this world is truly an atheist. I think we only have people who say they are. But I think every human being knows deep down, hardwired into their souls, into their very spirits, which are spiritual, which are a spark of God. They know there's a God, but they're really working hard to not believe in him. So, just some thoughts. You can take them or leave them. That's okay. And leave some comments. Drop me an email or make a comment to the video. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Maybe you have some stories of your own. Maybe some of you were one of these three kinds of atheists, and you've now made steps toward the true God, the God of the Word, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Messiah. All right, let's move on. Verses 2 through 4, Adonai looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. And this word man, children of man, is B'nai Adam. This is the word Adam. And he's looking down at the children of man and to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is Ein who does good. There's that word Ein again. Not even one. Have they no knowledge, all the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon Adonai? Now, this passage, verse 1 plus these three verses here, have been really misused and misapplied by many people in Christianity to say that the entire human race is utterly, completely corrupt and totally depraved. And that's a very extreme view, and this psalm does not support that whatsoever. But they'll quote this to say we're all just totally depraved. You know, I have talked with Christian friends who talk about the utter depravity of man. I look at them, I thought, if you really believe that everybody in the world is utterly depraved, you would not leave your house. We leave our houses all the time knowing that for the most part people will observe the traffic rules and people aren't going to try to come and kill them and eat them and destroy them and burn their houses down. I think we have a long way to go before the whole human race becomes totally depraved. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some depraved individuals out there and they need to be behind bars. But this utter depravity is a very extreme and wrong-headed teaching, and a dangerous one, in my opinion. So why is David saying this? Why is God speaking this through David? Well, what we need to see is that when God is saying this, he's looking at the people who say there is no God. These people who say, there's none righteous, everybody is out for himself, nobody does what's right. And so God looks at these people who say this, and he's saying, yeah, I'm looking among all you who believe this, and I don't see any of you doing what's right. But as we're going to see here, is that people aren't totally depraved. There are people who do good. There are righteous people. So let's just hold on and take a look. Verse 5. There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. Now, so if everybody's depraved, if everybody is wicked and none are doing good, then who are these righteous people? Who's this generation of the righteous? So you see, we have to take the whole psalm. We can't just rip a verse or two out of it and then apply it universally. We need to look at the whole psalm, the whole counsel, and the context in which God is speaking through David, or David himself is speaking. But it says, there they are in great terror. One of the things I've noticed about people who have convinced themselves that they're atheist is that they have great fear. I have an acquaintance, a friend, in fact, who claims to be an atheist. I think his atheism is getting shaken a bit. But one of the things he acknowledges to me is he is terrified of death. He's totally terrified of it. But he knows he's going to die. And if the beliefs of the atheist are correct, then when it's over, it's over. Life is gone forever. But as believers, not only are we not terrified of death, we're not even allowed to be, because we know that death is simply a door we walk through from the foyer into the throne room. And we look forward to that day. Paul, his faith in God was so great, he was looking forward to the day he steps out of this life. But he knew he had work to do here. I mean, we shouldn't be in a hurry, but we should not have any dread whatsoever of that day that we leave this realm, the Shadowlands, as C.S. Lewis called them, and we walk into the place of light. Ah, won't that be something? So, there they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous, and I think every atheist knows that. And then we come to the last two verses. You, referring to the people who don't believe in God, who claim there is no God, says you would shame the plans of the poor because Adonai is his refuge. It's almost as if God's saying, you guys who say there's no God, you know there is. You know there is. And you're in terror. And you shame the plans of the poor because Adonai is his refuge. You're angry at people who find their refuge in God. Because you've decided God doesn't exist, you're angry that anybody else believes that he does. And this is one of the things that always kind of makes me chuckle when I meet an atheist. Because for the most part, they're pretty militant that I quit believing in God too. Well, I don't believe in Bigfoot, but I'm not fixated on Bigfoot and have made it my life's purpose to make sure no one else believes in Bigfoot. So if these atheists really don't believe in God, then what do they care if other people do? But they've actually taken a stand against God, who they say doesn't exist. So how can they fight something that they say doesn't exist at all? Yet they try to align themselves to fight him. It's just a crazy thing. And then verse 7, oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. Now, again, he's asking for salvation to come forth from Zion for Israel. Well, why should Israel be saved if they're just wicked, if everybody's depraved? And again, the psalm is not saying that everybody is wicked. We'll look at the context again. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion when Adonai restores the fortunes of his people. So, in contrast to the people early in the psalm, where God says, I just can't find any good ones. There's none who seek me. There's none who are righteous. On the other hand, we find the people who are his people, the generation of the righteous. And he says, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. Now, I'm going to close with this. I mentioned at the beginning that there are two psalms, Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, that are almost word for word identical, except for one verse. And it's universally believed in Judaism that these two psalms were written to express God's attitude towards the Babylonians who took Israel into their first exile, and then the Romans who led Israel into the current exile. And that Psalm 14 has Babylon in view, King Nebuchadnezzar in particular, and Psalm 53 has Rome in view, Titus in particular, who came and ransacked Rome and destroyed the temple. And the interpreters say that God is looking at these armies, how merciless they were, how none of them cared that if God existed, and they came against God's people to enslave them, to kill them, to destroy their temple, and to do all these things as if God didn't exist. And again, as I said, this is pretty much universally believed among those in Judaism, among those who study the Psalms. And I'm not sure how far back this belief goes, but let's assume for a moment that it goes all the way back to the first century, to the times of Yeshua and the Apostle Paul. And the reason I'd like us just to imagine and assume that, and it may very well be true, but though I can't prove it, is that in Romans chapter 3, verses 9 to 18, Paul is writing, and though he's writing to the Romans, he's writing also to the enormous Jewish community there in Rome. And there's still a large Jewish community. There's a Jewish section in Rome with a beautiful synagogue. And so he's writing to them. He's writing to the Jews, and then he's writing to the Gentiles as well. And he's writing to the Jews to tell them that don't think that just because you're Jewish that you're in with God. Everything's fine. And listen to what he says. Starting with verse 9. What then? Are we Jews any better than them, the Goyim, the Gentiles? No, not at all. Now, he's just asked the question earlier, what advantage is there in being a Jew? And he says, oh, there's much in every way. But he says, but are we better than them? We have these advantages, but does that make us better? He says, no, not at all. For we have already charged at all, both Jews and Greeks, Gentiles, are under sin, as it is written. Now here he strings pearls. That's what this is called when a rabbi will take little snippets of verses that have the same theme and string them together. It's called stringing pearls. So Paul is stringing some pearls here. And so I'm going to read this and then give you the passages that he's quoting. He says, none is righteous, no, not one. That's Psalm 14, verse 1. No one understands, no one seeks for God. That's Psalm 14, verses 2 and 3. All have turned aside, together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one, which is another summarization of Psalm 14, verses 1 through 3. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. That's Psalm 5, 9. The venom of asps is under their lips. That's Psalm 140, verse 3. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Psalm 10, verse 7. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Now that's Proverbs 1:16. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Psalm 36:1. Now put yourself in the place of one of the Jewish recipients of this letter from Paul. And you realize that the first half of these quotes, which all come from Psalm 14, is a psalm that's written against Babylon, the Babylonian armies, Nebuchadnezzar in particular, who came in, who enslaved the people, exiled them, killed many, and destroyed the temple. And now this Rabbi Saul is saying that that applies to us. And yet you know at the end of the psalm, it refers to the generation of the righteous. It refers to the people who love God, the true Israel. Now, if I'm correct in my just surmising about this, he was trying to get the Jews of his day to realize that they should not be smug. That by not embracing Yeshua and continue to take a stand against him, they're actually aligning themselves with the Babylonians, the destroyers, rather than with the innocent Jewish people who were destroyed. It's a profound thing, and it would be deeply troubling to read it with this mindset. And something in me tells me that this is exactly the mindset Paul was trying to express. But he wasn't trying to beat up his brethren with these verses. He was trying to convict them and awaken them. He knew they already believed in God, but it's like, take another step. And don't believe in God the Father, but be an atheist towards his son Yeshua, the Messiah. Take the step and embrace him as well. Because to reject Messiah is to a great degree to reject God himself. To reject the Father. If you reject his representative, his son, you're rejecting him. Don't do that. Embrace him as well. Because Yeshua came as the mouthpiece of the Father. to live out the actions of the Father, to speak the words of the Father, to do the things he heard and saw the Father do. So, don't say you love God, then hate your Jewish brother, Yeshua. So anyways, something to think about. And you wouldn't think there'd be so much stuff just in these 7 verses, but welcome to the Psalms. And again, I've shared more opinion in the Psalm than I normally do in these studies, and you're welcome to take it or leave it. You're not going to hurt my feelings if you leave it. But until next time, I wish you shalom and may God bless.